She left behind 3,000 pairs of shoes. The people she was supposed to serve couldn't afford one. Imelda Marcos was called the Steel Butterfly. Part glamour icon, part iron will. She charmed dictators, danced with presidents, and bought skyscrapers like most people buy groceries. But here's the question that history can't shake. While she was spending billions of stolen pesos on shoes, jewelry, and real estate, where were the Filipino people? This is the story of a woman who convinced herself, and nearly convinced the world, that plundering a nation was actually an act of love. Imelda Romualdez was born in 1929 into one of Manila's most prominent families. On paper, that sounds like a fairy tale beginning. In reality, it was anything but. Her father Vicente, a lawyer with a prestigious name and an empty bank account, eventually went bankrupt. When her mother Remedios died giving birth to their sixth child together, the once respected Romualdez family collapsed entirely. And then life handed young Imelda something almost too cinematic to believe. The family was forced to move into a garage, not a house, a garage. And the cruelest part? It was located within sight of Malacañang Palace, the grandest symbol of Philippine power and privilege. Every day, barefoot and hungry, a young girl who had once known comfort could literally see the life she'd been robbed of. Some people would have accepted their fate. Imelda Romualdez decided she was going to get inside that palace, one way or another. At 10, her father moved the family to the province of Leyte, in the town of Tacloban. Imelda threw herself into her studies, earning a degree in education. But while academics gave her stability, it was something else entirely that would become her golden ticket: her face. By 1953, at 24, Imelda returned to Manila. She entered a beauty pageant, finished second, and because the concept of losing apparently never made it into her personal vocabulary, she demanded a title anyway. They eventually gave her one: Muse of Manila. It was the first time Imelda Marcos rewrote a result she didn't like. It would not be the last. Enter Ferdinand Marcos, young, ruthlessly ambitious congressman, sharp mind, grand political dreams, and apparently very little patience, because when he met Imelda in 1954, he proposed within 30 minutes. Before the coffee had even cooled, Imelda said yes. 11 days later, they were married. A whirlwind romance? A strategic alliance? Almost certainly it's both. Because what Ferdinand had in political cunning, he lacked in public warmth. And Imelda, beautiful, magnetic, a natural performer, was exactly the asset his ambitions required. When Ferdinand ran for president in 1965, Imelda didn't just campaign for him. She campaigned like a force of nature, traveling the country, singing at rallies, weeping at the right moments, charming voters in ways that Ferdinand's sharp edges never could. Political analysts would later credit her with delivering him an extra million votes. When he won, she didn't step into the role of First Lady, she floated into it. The barefoot girl who had once pressed her face against the fence of Malacañang Palace was now its queen. And she intended to rule in style. For the international press, the Marcoses were a fairy tale. Ferdinand was the strong man. Imelda was his glamorous counterpart, compared endlessly to Jacqueline Kennedy. But where Jackie was understated elegance, Imelda had a different philosophy entirely. Why be subtle when you can be spectacular? She began pouring government money into extravagant building projects, luxury hotels, a cultural center modeled on Lincoln Center in New York, lavish theaters, all while the majority of Filipinos survived on $2 a day. When critics pointed out that these gleaming buildings sat directly adjacent to Manila's slums, Imelda had a response ready. Here in the Philippines, we live in a paradise. There are no poor people, as there are in other countries. Imelda Marcos. She was saying this from inside a gilded palace. But why let reality ruin a good spending spree? Her personal shopping trips became legendary. New York, Rome, Copenhagen, Cartier, Bulgari, private art collections featuring Michelangelo and Botticelli, which she insisted were destined for Philippine museums. It was just a coincidence they looked much better in her personal residences. By the late 1970s, she had earned an almost unbelievable title, the world's biggest private buyer of precious stones. And yet, even at her most extravagant, Imelda Marcos never stopped asking for a discount. Because when you're embezzling millions of dollars from a developing nation, every centavo counts. Things were already turbulent when, in 1972, Ferdinand Marcos imposed martial law across the Philippines, citing a communist threat that conveniently justified turning his presidency into a permanent dictatorship. Civil liberties were suspended. Political opponents were jailed, or worse. The state-controlled media ran a carefully curated highlight reel of prosperity and progress, while the country's actual condition was quietly erased from public view. Imelda threw her full support behind the move. With democracy out of the way, there was simply so much more room to maneuver. Historians coined a phrase for what came next: the conjugal dictatorship. As Ferdinand tightened his grip on the nation, Imelda tightened hers on him, becoming governor of Metro Manila, a cabinet member, and a self-appointed global diplomat. She flew to Libya to negotiate with Muammar Gaddafi. She charmed Chairman Mao. She secured a discount oil deal with Saddam Hussein, her talent for haggling proving useful well beyond high-end boutiques. She sang impromptu performances for world leaders. She bonded with Ronald and Nancy Reagan over their shared love of a well-managed narrative. Meanwhile, back home, 1 in 2 Filipinos lived in poverty. Political prisoner Benigno Ninoy Aquino, Ferdinand's most vocal critic, sat in a jail cell for 7 years. And the Marcos wealth kept growing. Between 1981 and 1983 alone, an estimated $40 million was funneled from the Philippine treasury into Imelda's personal New York real estate portfolio. On one notorious shopping trip, she debated purchasing the Empire State Building before deciding it was too ostentatious. Too ostentatious for Imelda Marcos. Instead, she settled for the $51 million Crown Building and the $60 million Herald Center. By the early 1980s, she had entered the ranks of the world's 10 wealthiest women. By the early 1980s, Ferdinand Marcos was gravely ill, and the regime's carefully constructed illusion was starting to crack. Ninoy Aquino, released from prison and exiled to the United States, made a decision that shocked everyone who knew the risks. He was going home. On August 21st, 1983, Aquino flew back to Manila, surrounded by a convoy of international journalists determined to confront Marcos face-to-face and appeal for a restoration of democracy. He never made it out of the airport. Ninoy Aquino was shot in the head the moment he stepped off the plane. The assassination was broadcast live. The world watched in horror, and everything changed. Whoever ordered the killing, a question that remains officially unresolved, had made a catastrophic miscalculation. Aquino's death didn't silence the opposition. It ignited it. His widow, Corazon Cory Aquino, stepped into the political vacuum. Quiet and determined, she became the face of everything the Marcos regime had tried to erase: decency, accountability, and the possibility of a Philippines that actually belonged to its people. In December 1985, a weekend Marcos called a snap election, apparently under the delusion that political theater could still work in his favor. Cory Aquino won. Marcos, whose hypocrisy had no ceiling, refused to accept the result and accused her of fraud, while his own administration had just run the most blatantly rigged election in Philippine history. It didn't matter. The people had already decided. What followed would become known as the People Power Revolution. A handful of rebel military officers barricaded themselves inside the Defense Ministry in Manila. An independent radio station, Radio Veritas, broadcast an urgent call to the Filipino people. Come to EDSA, the main highway of Metro Manila. Stand with the rebels. Stand with each other. They came by the hundreds of thousands. The atmosphere was surreal. Part revolution, part festival. Street vendors sold souvenirs. Families picnicked on the highway. People sang. And then the tanks arrived. Instead of running, they stepped forward. Women placed flowers in gun barrels. Nuns and priests dropped to their knees directly in front of armored vehicles, clutching rosary beads like shields. Young girls reached up toward soldiers and pressed flowers into their hands. The commander gave the order to advance. The soldiers laid down their weapons. Not a single shot was fired. Inside Malacañang Palace, Imelda watched her empire dissolve in real time. Their allies were abandoning them. And then came the final blow. A blunt message from their longtime benefactor, the United States of America. On February 25th, 1986, after 14 years of absolute power, Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos fled the Philippines in a U.S. military helicopter, suitcases stuffed with jewelry, cash, and priceless artifacts. The conjugal dictatorship ended not with a bang, but with a boarding pass. When the gates of Malacañang Palace swung open, the Filipino people got their first look at what their suffering had paid for. 3,000 pairs of shoes, bulletproof bras, 58 ball gowns, over 800 handbags, gallons of imported perfume, a personal art collection that included works by Michelangelo and Botticelli. Still, as it turned out, in her personal rooms, not the museums she'd promised. The headlines went around the world. Imelda, naturally, had a response ready. They went to my closet and found shoes, not skeletons. Imelda Marcos. The country she left behind was drowning in $27.5 billion in foreign debt. 1 in 2 Filipinos was unemployed. The Philippine economy had collapsed under the weight of decades of systematic looting. But Imelda Marcos was not done. Exiled to Hawaii, she endured the unspeakable hardship of beachfront living. Ferdinand Marcos died in exile in 1989, still baffled by the concept of consequences. Imelda flew back to the Philippines and faced trial. In 1990, she stood before a New York court charged with funneling $140 million in stolen money into U.S. real estate. The evidence was overwhelming. She was acquitted. In a performance that would have impressed even the most seasoned con artist, she turned the jury with wide-eyed innocence, tearful explanations, and the practiced vulnerability of a woman who had spent a lifetime performing for audiences that mattered. She celebrated her acquittal as, quote, a triumph for the underdog. The underdog. The woman who once debated buying the Empire State Building. She returned to Philippine politics. Her son Bong Marcos was elected president of the Philippines in 2022. Imelda herself has remained a public figure, attending events, giving interviews, occasionally revisiting her greatest hits. Some people leave the stage. Imelda simply refuses to find the exit. From a garage within sight of a palace, to the palace itself. From barefoot poverty to 3,000 pairs of shoes. From a nation's hope to its most enduring wound. Imelda Marcos is many things. A survivor, a performer, a cautionary tale dressed in couture. But perhaps most of all, she is proof that when power goes unchecked long enough, it doesn't just corrupt, it becomes completely convinced of its own virtue. I never intended to hurt anyone. Everything I did was for love. Imelda Marcos, to this day.